Hello guys, I hope you're well. Happy New Year. I hope you're ready for another Junk Kouture Masterclass. Today we're going to be focusing on pattern cutting a bodycon dress, looking at all the key elements and preparing your pattern, cutting your pattern and then sewing your pattern together. I want to start by going through some of the key elements that you need to put in place when you first start cutting your pattern, and one of these is notches. Notches are there as guidelines to align your fabric once you're sewing your garment. This will cause it to keep its shape, not become misshaped, and create a better fit once it's complete. Another key aspect that you need to look out for is the grain line. The grain line is the weave of the fabric. Usually an unnoticed aspect of the garment until you might get to the end of the garment and notice that the fit is not correct. This could be caused by the grain line and it not being in the right position when you cut out your fabric. The straight grain is the grain that's used in most garments when pattern cutting. The straight grain generally runs up the centre front and the centre back of garments and up through the centre of sleeves or trouser legs. When cutting out your garment, the pattern should be laid with the grain line parallel to the selvage edge, similar to this picture here. I now want to move on to seam allowance. All your patterns should have 1 cm seam allowance around the outside of your pattern. This will give you a 1 cm guideline for when sewing your garment together. Once finished sewing, you can then iron your seams flat, leaving 1 cm either side, not taking away any of the fabric from the outside of the garment and leaving a really smooth finish on the outside of the garment. Notice in the pattern that I'm doing here, I don't have any seam allowance on the centre front or centre back. This is because I'm using a stretch fabric for this pattern and I'm going to be cutting my pattern on the fold. Take this into consideration when doing the pattern for your garment. Maybe your centre front and say a centre back have seams or an open closure on the front or back, therefore you need to add 1 cm on the front or the back of your garment pattern. Now I'm going to move on to the facings. Facings are used for the hems and the bottom of the garments to give it a really clean finished edge. For this pattern I'm going to be adding a 5 cm facing. Instead of sewing it onto the garment, I've grown it onto my pattern, meaning that it will fold back upon itself and then be stitched. This can also be used where you add 1 cm seam allowance and you do a separate pattern which can be attached. Now that we've put all the essential pattern cutting needs in place, we can move on to placing the pattern onto the garment, keeping in mind the grain line, and start cutting our garment. For this, place your pattern onto the fabric and you can either use pins like I'm doing, or you can use tailor's chalk, trace the outside of your pattern, take the pattern off and then cut your garment. Notice how my pattern is laid on the straighter grain. If this pattern was laid at an angle, it would be known as the bias, cutting on the biased, and this may cause problems to your fit and the overall look of your garment. So before you cut anything, please make sure that your grain is in line with the fabric. This will cause no waste and also it will make life much easier when sewing your garment. Now the notches that you marked out in your pattern at the start, remember to snip into them notches on your fabric so when you take your pattern off, you still have your guidelines to use when you're sewing your garment. As previously mentioned, I'm going to be using stretch fabric for this pattern, and this is because it's a bodycon dress and I wanted to really hug the body. So I won't be using a sewing machine, I'll be using an overlocker, a 4-thread overlocker, and this is because it's stretch and the stitches won't break when using this machine. If I were to use a normal sewing machine for this and doing a straight stitch, what you would find when stretching the fabric that the stitches may break. As you can see in the video, I'm preparing to sew a seam. Remember that you have to put both of the right sides of the fabrics together because this will be the inside of your garment. You don't want to see any stitches from the outside of the garment, and you just follow down the 1 cm seam allowance that you put into your pattern as the guideline, and that will just give it a really nice finish and not affect the fit If you were to go outside of this seam allowance, say 1.5, 2 centimeters, this could cause problems to the fit of the garment. It might not fit, or it might not be the correct shape. So here we are, this is the pattern that we cut out. We've stitched it together with 2 side seams and we've attached 2 sleeves. I've finished the sleeves with a rolled hem and then used a cover stitch machine to give it a nice finish. The cover stitch machine allows for stretch and it's able to handle it. If I was to use a straight stitch with this, there'd be big problems when stretching the fabric, which will cause seams to burst or hems to break. So when using your materials, keep into account what machine should I be using, what stitch should I be using, because the last thing that you want to happen is stitches to burst, seams to burst, and your garment to break. Here in the video I'm just pointing out how the seams are running smoothly from the sleeve seam to the side seam. This gives it a really clean professional finish. So when sewing your garment, keep these things in mind because it makes a big difference to the finish of your garment. If I was to risk not using sleeve notches and then using them notches as guidelines when sewing, I'd face big problems with the fit. I'd end up with excess material when sewing the sleeve, and then I'll end up with a bad fit on the sleeve and puckering. Now, because these simple steps to take at the start of pattern making, with the grain line being in the correct position, notches as guidelines, and your 1 centimeter seam allowance as a guideline, you're eliminating these problems from happening, and you're starting with a really quality good start, which should end up with a beautiful finished garment. So follow these steps, do everything correctly before you end up cutting the fabric. Don't rush, because rushing will cause problems. Take it slow, measure everything, make sure your notches are in place, make sure you're using the correct machine, the correct stitch, and I'm sure you'll be having a beautiful garment at the end as an end result. And that's it for today's masterclass. If you have any questions about certain fabrics, machines, patterns or stitches, get in touch at studio@resellist.com and I'll get right back to you. Thank you and I'll see you soon.